And welcome to the webinar. My name is Olivia Price and I'm a PhD student here at NDARC, and it's my pleasure to be hosting today's webinar. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Gadigal and Bidjigal people as the traditional custodians of the land on which UNSW is located. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia, noting that our speakers and audience are joining from many different locations across Australia. We pay our respects to the elders past and present and extend that respect to any First Nations people present today. Now I'm delighted to introduce today's speaker, Sarah Clifford. Sarah is a postdoctoral researcher and future leader fellow at the Menzies School of Health Research. Her work focuses on the relationship between alcohol use and harm and how policies can impact these outcomes. She has a background in health promotion and is currently undertaking a fellowship focused on the commercial determinants of alcohol use and harm in the Northern Territory. In today's webinar, Sarah will highlight some key findings from her PhD, which explored the effects of the 2017 to 18 Northern Territory alcohol reforms, specifically the banned drinker register, minimum unit price, and police auxiliary liquor inspectors on adult, domestic, family, and sexual violence. I'm excited that during question and answer time, we'll have the opportunity to hear from Associate Professor Michael Livingston from the National Drug Research Institute at Curtin University. Michael is one of Australia's leading alcohol policy researchers. He's published over 200 papers, which have largely focused on evaluating the impacts of alcohol policy changes at the population level, ensuring data on alcohol consumption and related harms are as robust as possible, and trying to unpack the drivers of trends in population drinking, particularly among young people. Sarah and Michael will take questions from the audience after Sarah's presentation, and you can log questions for them using the Q&A function in Zoom. I will relay as many questions as possible to the speakers at the end of the presentation, but we might not have time to get to all of them. But that's enough for me. So Sarah, I'll hand over to you and ask you to turn on your camera and get your presentation underway.
Great, thank you so much, Liv. So good afternoon, my name is Sarah, and I'm a research fellow at the Menzies School of Health Research in the Alcohol and Other Drugs team. As Liv said, today I'm going to be presenting on my PhD, which is currently under examination. It's titled The Effect of Alcohol Policies on Adult, Domestic, Family and Sexual Violence in the Northern Territory. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining this meeting from Yolngu country, and I'd like to pay my respects to the elders past and present. I'd also like to acknowledge that many people will be joining from many different Aboriginal nations across Australia, and I extend my respect to the elders of those areas and to any First Nations people joining the meeting today. The area of land that we now call the Northern Territory has been populated for at least 60,000 years, comprised of many distinct Aboriginal nations. Although Australia's colonisation by Britain began in 1788, they didn't attempt to settle the north of the continent until the 1820s. The NT is geographically isolated from other parts of Australia. There are large stretches of desert and wild terrain that separate it from other Australian jurisdictions. The white settlers were not prepared for the climate, and despite the long-standing survival and custodianship of the land by Aboriginal peoples, the first attempts at settling the NT ended in starvation and ultimately failure. It actually took 40 years of attempts, so not until the 1860s for one of these settlements to be maintained. And even now, the NT is much less populated than the rest of the country. I'm going to be providing a little bit of current NT context. There's a lot of aspects of the NT, but particularly remote NT, that can seem pretty foreign. And I think when some people hear about the alcohol policies that are in place, some of this context can be helpful. I'm using my lived experience here, so it's not going to be reflective of everyone's experience of living remote, but I live in Nhulunbuy. My partner is a teacher at the high school here. Lots of places in the NT have no sealed road access, which means that in the wet season, places get cut off, and this can interfere with things like food security. There are lots of Aboriginal languages spoken throughout the NT, and for many people, English is a third or fourth language. In places like East Arnhem, lots of people speak similar languages, so signs can be in both English and Yolngu. But in other places, there are many different languages used, and this can be challenging for ensuring access to translators. About 50% of the NT is legally Aboriginal land, and that's highlighted in peach on the map. That means if there's a non-Indigenous land used like a mine, then the land gets leased. So houses on Aboriginal land are generally provided. If you're a community member, they're government housing because individual people cannot own or buy part of Aboriginal land. It's communally owned through a land trust. And if you're there for work, then they're provided by your workplace. Even though some towns and communities are very remote, there are many Aboriginal people who live even further out at homelands and outstations, which are basically tiny communities, typically made up of family groups between 20 and 50 people. Remote places are more vulnerable to power and communication loss, and access to things like healthcare and the legal system can be more challenging. There are lots of idiosyncrasies of remote Australia, one of which is the fact that we do swim, even though there definitely are crocodiles. And speaking of these idiosyncrasies, there are a lot of strange ways of managing alcohol access, or at least things that can seem quite strange from an outsider perspective. Alcohol was introduced as part of colonisation, often in a transactional sense, and it's something that many Aboriginal people see as causing harm. Aboriginal people were granted the right to drink in the NT in 1964, and since then there's been a long history of grassroots initiatives to limit alcohol access. So in the first NT Liquor Act, there was a provision to allow communities to make specific requests and have them legislated. On the Gove Peninsula, where I live, this looks like a liquor permit scheme. Everyone starts from a baseline of not being able to purchase takeaway alcohol, and then you apply for that privilege. So I have a liquor permit, there's a photo of me filling in my application. In other communities, there are community clubs, which are like other community or member-owned clubs across Australia, but there are additional limits associated with these clubs. For example, individuals are limited to 6 mid-strength beers per person, as you can see in the photo taken at the Nui Club in Warramunga on the Tiwi Islands. Now, in the context of alcohol, these policies are incredibly niche and specific. However, these types of approaches, so things like permits and clubs, have been considered in other places in the context of other drugs, particularly cannabis. If we zoom back out to the NT as a whole, alcohol consumption and related harms are much higher in the NT than the rest of the country. And you can see in this policy timeline, the NT has had a long history of introducing policies that attempt to address alcohol-related harms, some of which have included domestic and family violence. There have been a lot of policies introduced and repealed, and in some cases reintroduced. Alcohol is really politicised, which is why we see so much change over the decades. Now, in 2016, a Labor government was elected and they ran on the platform of reintroducing a banned drinker register. They also commissioned the Riley Review, which was a massive review of alcohol policy and legislation, from which there was 220 recommendations. And within these recommendations, there was a recommended minimum unit price and recommended police auxiliary liquor inspectors. Now, the BDR is basically the inverse of the permit system that I just mentioned. So the permit system on the Gove Peninsula is an inclusionary permit system. You apply for the right to purchase takeaway alcohol. The BDR is an exclusionary permit system where you lose the right to buy all alcohol, but it is only enforced at takeaway outlets. People can be put on the BDR through the courts. So if someone has an alcohol condition on their parole order, by an authorised person like a doctor or a social worker, through automated police pathways or self-referral. And like I said, it's only enforced at takeaway outlets where everyone hands over their ID to the cashier who scans it, and it comes up as either red, so you're banned, or green, you're good to go. Now, daily purchase limits and opening hour restrictions are an anomaly in these set of policies because they are not part of that Labor government alcohol reform package. They were introduced after a very publicised case of child sexual abuse occurred in Tennant Creek, and they were only applicable in Tennant Creek. They were introduced using the government's emergency powers, which lots of people are aware of post-COVID, but we weren't as aware of them at the time. And they reduced the opening hours for takeaway outlets to 3 hours, so from 4 to 7 p.m, closed on Sundays, and they introduced individual daily purchase limits. These individual limits are monitored through the same scanners that the BDR uses. Because this policy was introduced within the timeframe of the study, even though it's not part of that kind of official package, we still need to take it into account. Minimum unit price legislation means that a standard alcoholic drink may not be sold for less than a certain price. And in the NT, that price is $1.30. So, for example, if you have a 6-pack of beers and each can contains 1.2 standard drinks, then the 6-pack has to be sold for $9.40 or more. You can see from that example, what it really impacts is super cheap alcohol. So stuff like cask wine or those clean-skinned wines. The Riley Review did actually recommend the price be set at $1.50, and that indexation should occur. It was watered down to $1.30 because the NT government didn't want to impact things like beer. They wanted to focus on those really, really cheap wines. And they did actually legislate indexation, but they just refused to do it for the past 6 years. As early as 2012, police in the NT started screening customers at bottle shop entries to prevent the purchase of takeaway alcohol by people who didn't have a legal place to consume it. This could be because the person's address is in a dry area or because they don't have a permanent address. This wasn't a separate policy per se, rather the police were trying to enhance other policies' effectiveness, like the dry areas, like public drinking legislation, through enforcement. After the Riley Review, they shifted this role to auxiliary officers who are similar to like a protective services officer in Victoria. And this is important because previously when the police did this, they did it when there was time, it wasn't their main job. Whereas when pallies were introduced, they provided permanent coverage of all bottle shops in Alice Springs, Tennant Creek, and Katherine. I'm going to pause on alcohol policy and talk about domestic, family, and sexual violence for a moment. So the NT has incredibly high rates of domestic, family, and sexual violence. It's the highest in the nation. It's particularly high for Aboriginal women and girls. Like with alcohol, there are some seemingly strange aspects to the domestic and family violence legislation in the NT. For example, there are mandatory reporting requirements for everyone regarding domestic and family violence. So unlike mandatory reporting in other states, which is focused on children, this is applicable to anyone of any age. Now, delving into the merits and pitfalls of this type of legislation is outside the scope of my presentation, but I'm sure people can imagine that this is not without controversy. However, it was introduced following a coronial of the murder of a woman who had been subject to many years of abuse, which had been recorded in things like her health record, but never reported to police. And the intention of the legislation was to make domestic and family violence everyone's problem. There is a lot of discourse on domestic and family violence in the NT. There is currently a major inquest into the death of 4 Aboriginal women at the hands of their partners. And a few years ago, there was another inquest into the suicides of 3 Aboriginal teenage girls in remote communities who were all experiencing physical and sexual violence from their boyfriends and other men in the lead up to their death. Despite all of these reviews and all of this work, it is seen, because it is such a huge issue, it is also seen as quite an intractable one. There is sometimes an element of apathy and also quite a bit of disagreement regarding the best approach for addressing the issue. We know that alcohol-involved domestic and family violence is a huge issue in the NT, and we know from national and international work that alcohol increases the frequency and severity of violence. However, domestic and family violence is often used to advocate for alcohol restrictions, and sometimes this creates tension between domestic violence advocates and other groups. Systematic reviews tell us that the evidence regarding how alcohol policies impact domestic and family violence is mixed. There was a review in 2014 that found weak evidence that reductions in price and availability were associated with reductions in domestic violence, but they note that the evidence base is limited. A more recent rapid review in 2023 also found the evidence base to be limited. Now, domestic and family violence is incredibly hard to capture. Such a small proportion of it is ever reported to the police or recognised by hospital staff. And in the NT, there has been an effort to examine the different types of alcohol restriction, the effect of different types of alcohol restrictions on domestic and family violence. But as we can see from Heinz's review, this can be really challenging in small populations, which is really relevant for those community-specific restrictions. So in this PhD, I was interested in understanding whether these very prominent alcohol policies were actually impacting domestic, family, and sexual violence. Policy interventions are not investigator-initiated, nor are researchers able to control the study environment. You can't randomise the exposure. And so natural experiment studies are often used to generate an evidence base. There are a few different definitions of what a natural experiment actually is, and there's debate as to whether it's a study design or is it just an unplanned opportunity for research. There's also debate about whether natural experiments must be experimental or if they can simply be observational, so a simple pre-post study. The argument for the latter is that the evidence generated through weak study designs is better than no evidence at all. On the last slide, I mentioned that in small places, it's often really hard to have the numbers to do that more rigorous analysis. And these are the sort of places where we see those pre-post analysis. My PhD was positioned under the LEARNT study, so learning from alcohol policy reform in the NT. And within that overall study, we went for an interrupted time series approach to see whether there was immediate or gradual change in outcomes on a population level. In addition, analysis of multiple data sources can increase confidence in results, such as using different data to measure the same outcome or multiple outcomes to understand broader changes in a domain. In this PhD, I used different data sources, so police and hospital data, to look at the same outcome, domestic and family violence. I was also specifically interested in adult violence, which, in line with the Australian Bureau of Statistics, we defined as violence that occurred when the victim was aged 15 or older, with child abuse being excluded from the scope of the study. The BDR came into effect on the 1st of September 2017, and the number of individuals on the register increased in the months following implementation. So we actually ran two models, one which assessed changes associated with the introduction and an alternate model which assessed changes after the number of active bans per month had plateaued at around 3,000. Because there are so many different policies and some apply in some places and not in others, we did do analysis at the NT level, but we also did analysis at the town level. So starting with the BDR, you can see that at both time points, we saw increases in different measures of domestic and family violence. The obvious question following that slide is, well, did the BDR actually make domestic and family violence worse? And the answer to that is probably not. You'll notice for all my findings, I put that probable caveat because it's extremely difficult to attribute causality in these types of studies. Although we saw increases, they were mainly in the police data, not in the hospital data. Now, committing an alcohol-related offence and being the defendant on an alcohol-related DVO are both automatic triggers to be added to the BDR by police. An alternate explanation for the increase in police-reported domestic violence might be that there was a change in practice of recording alcohol involvement by police. However, this is pretty unlikely because the total number of assaults increased rather than just those involving alcohol. What we can say is the BDR was not associated with reductions, which is still notable because, as I mentioned, domestic family violence offenders are a target group of the policy, and people are automatically placed on the BDR when they commit an alcohol-related offence, and that, of course, includes domestic violence-related offences, or the defendant on an alcohol-related DVO. So why do we see those increases? As I mentioned in an earlier slide, prior to the PALIs, police fulfilled this function sporadically. There are some media releases from an alcohol advocacy group in Alice Springs that say the police coverage of takeaway outlets reduced after the BDR. So it's possible that there may have been increased access to alcohol. In an evaluation of alcohol restrictions in northern WA and the Fitzroy Valley, they also found increases in domestic violence assaults following restrictions. Both police and service providers in this area attributed it to a decreased tolerance of domestic violence and an increased willingness of victims and witnesses to report because they themselves were less intoxicated. We also know that the BDR is fairly easy to circumvent via passive secondary supply through drinking at licensed premises and through the black market. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later on. So moving on to the MUP, we saw decreases in most outcomes at a territory level and also in Alice Springs. Now, Alice Springs is confounded by the very similar timing of the PALI introduction. So MUP came into place on the 1st of October 2018, and there was full coverage of PALIs on all takeaway outlets in Alice Springs by the 3rd of October. So you can't test two interventions that came in sort of 3 days apart. They're completely confounded, and that's why that is in pink. So we do see those decreases. Can we say that MUP decreased domestic and family violence? Again, the disclaimer that it's not possible to attribute causality. However, if MUP was having an impact, we would expect to see the decreases in Darwin, which acts as a quasi-control site because they have never had PALIs. This is actually consistent with what other evidence from different jurisdictions says about the impact of MUP on violence. Systematic reviews indicate that MUP is effective at reducing alcohol consumption and alcohol-related hospital admissions and mortality, but it's not been shown to be effective at reducing assaults and other crimes. There's one really important exception to this. So Miller and colleagues did find reductions of all alcohol-related assaults in Greater Darwin following the MUP introduction. But as I mentioned, we don't find that sort of change for domestic and family violence specifically. As I said earlier, the MUP was set lower than recommended, and it also has not been indexed. So Nick Taylor has done some really great work looking at the proportion of the market share that the NT MUP impacts compared with other places across the world, so places like Scotland, Canada, and the NT MUP impacts a much lower proportion of the market. So if we move on to PALIs, that's the policy that confounded the MUP findings in Alice Springs. Again, we do see those decreases highlighted in pink, but we also see decreases in other sites where PALIs and MUP came in about 3 months apart, and so we did test those separately. So probably yes, PALIs seem like they are associated with some reductions in domestic and family violence. Now, PALIs don't exist anywhere else. It's really hard to know what we expected based on existing literature. PALIs seem like they do reduce access to alcohol, so it makes sense that they are associated with decreases in domestic and family violence. Now, they primarily enforce restrictions on land that is legally Aboriginal, which is mostly populated by Aboriginal peoples, and enforce restrictions on public drinking, which mostly impacts homeless populations. And in the NT, the homeless population is primarily Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. PALIs have faced criticism from some Aboriginal people and organisations for being racist and being a targeted intervention, but they also have some support from others. It's worth noting that there are other policy options that are likely to reduce domestic and family violence, which are not targeted in the same way. Following the Tennant Creek restrictions, there were actually very big drops in police-reported domestic and family violence assault. Like 92% is huge. We weren't able to test hospital admissions because the numbers were too low, which, as I mentioned earlier, is one of the pitfalls of trying to do this sort of work in areas with really small populations. So yes, it does look like purchase limits and opening hour restrictions were associated with decreases in domestic and family violence. Because this intervention only exists in Tennant Creek, there are limitations associated with the data. That huge magnitude of change is probably due to the small population size. So small changes have a larger proportional impact, and we shouldn't expect to see such a big drop if these types of restrictions were implemented in other population centres. In late Jan 2023, there actually were similar restrictions introduced in Alice Springs, including the closure of takeaway outlets on Monday and Tuesday, 1 takeaway purchase per person per day, as well as the reinstalment of blanket dry areas. These changes haven't yet been evaluated in the peer-reviewed literature, but the Central Australian Aboriginal Congress has published some descriptive data that indicates that similar types of changes in domestic and family violence were seen in Alice Springs following these restrictions. Now, you might have noticed that I started the presentation talking about domestic, family, and sexual violence, and then the sexual violence component sort of just dropped off. I did look at adult sexual violence and found that the rates were very high. Now, generally, sexual assault rates are reported for all victims, not just for victims 15 and older. We tend to see the 15 and older framing with other data sources, so like the Personal Safety Survey. That means we actually don't have a direct comparator for the rate of adult sexual assaults in other places in Australia, but based on what we could find, it does seem to be particularly high. Although less than half involved alcohol involvement was not known for 35% of records, so we take 40% as a lower bound estimate. We were only able to test the impact of alcohol policies on sexual violence across the NT as a whole and in Darwin because the numbers were too low in the other towns. We know that sexual violence is massively underreported, and we actually don't know a huge amount about sexual violence in the NT, partly because of those low numbers influenced by a low population, and partly because there just hasn't been as much focus on sexual violence as there has been on domestic and family violence. However, it is currently the NT includes it as part of the package, so it is included within the domestic and family violence package. So I thought it was still very important to highlight and to look at. In this PhD, I generated evidence that some policies in that 2017-2018 time period were associated with decreases in domestic and family violence, and some were not. And no policy was associated with decreases in sexual violence. This aligns with that existing evidence that the impact of alcohol policies on domestic, family, and sexual violence is mixed. Of the 4 policies I looked at, 2 were targeted and 2 were population-wide, and 1 of each was associated with decreases. Neither of the policies that were associated with decreases have been discussed very much in the lead up to the recent election. In the lead up to the election, there was much more of a focus on the BDR and the MUP. So at the end of last year, there was an increase in the number of automatic pathways onto the BDR, and these were mostly focused on things like public drinking and sort of public nuisance. So police were issuing immediate 7-day ban drinker orders for people who were taken into alcohol-related protective custody, who got an alcohol-related infringement notice, or who consumed alcohol in a prohibited place. Both major parties were very focused on clamping down on secondary supply. As I mentioned earlier, because the BDR is an individualised measure, there's some pretty big loopholes for continuing to access alcohol while on the BDR. And the secondary supply of alcohol to people on the BDR has been front and centre for a while, but particularly in the last year. So as a society, we consider alcohol a shared substance. It's incredibly hard to police secondary supply. I've popped some examples on the slide of people who wouldn't ordinarily consider themselves to be involved in illegal activities who are participating in secondary supply. In places where alcohol access is restricted, most people are engaging in secondary supply, but they don't conceptualise it like that. The primary public conversation around secondary supply is focused firstly on grog running, which is taking alcohol into dry areas and selling it at an inflated price, but also the passive secondary supply, specifically between Aboriginal family members. We know that this discourse is something that the alcohol industry favours. The Endeavour Group organised and ran roundtables focused on developing research focused on reducing our secondary supply. And prior to the election, they were actively trying to direct politicians using this information. We also know that the industry fought pretty hard to water down the MUP, both prior to its introduction. I mentioned we ended up with $1.30 instead of $1.50, but also while it's been in place, it's never been indexed. The NT had an election on the 24th of August and a country Liberal Party majority was elected. As part of their campaign and in some media interviews since their election, they have promised to repeal the MUP. This is concerning from a national perspective because we had jurisdictions like WA and NT considering MUPs and looking to the Northern Territory. And it's concerning from a local perspective with lots of organisations raising concerns about increasing access to cheap alcohol. So does alcohol policy have a role to play in reducing domestic and family violence? Again, probably yes. So yes, with caveats. The role needs to be considered critically. Domestic and family violence in the context of alcohol restrictions are often discussed regarding the extremely high rates, the extremely high prevalence of alcohol involvement. But there's also concerns that the focus on domestic and family violence continues to perpetuate narratives about individualised responsibility. Now, this is a recognised industry tactic focused on shifting the blame away from products and their marketing onto consumers and their behaviours. This individualised rhetoric is used to promote those targeted measures instead of evidence-based population-wide approaches. So we know that domestic, family and sexual violence is really prevalent across Australia and particularly in the NT. So in the NT, they estimate 32% of women, so just under a third, have experienced domestic and family violence, and 27%, so about over a quarter, estimated to have experienced sexual violence. However, we know that in the public discourse, domestic, family and sexual violence is often understood as an individual problem. It's really important to make sure that the very real issue of alcohol-involved domestic and family violence isn't used by industry or by the government to other the problem of alcohol and turn that focus onto the sort of troublesome few. The Menzies AOD team is actually beginning some work looking at examining industry's influence on the public narratives of alcohol in the NT. So how should alcohol policy be used to address domestic, family and sexual violence? Although harms to others are often considered in alcohol policy research, the focus is often on violence and assaults generally. Globally, it's still not standard practice to include domestic, family and sexual violence as an outcome measure in alcohol policy evaluation. If we hope to impact domestic, family and sexual violence through alcohol policy implementation, we need to be explicit regarding the mechanism by which we think the policy will address the issue. So what is the mechanism of change when the policies are designed? We also need to be explicit when we have evidence that policies do reduce domestic and family violence, so things like those restricted trading hours, and where the evidence still needs to be generated, where we just don't know how this policy is going to impact domestic and family violence. There have been multiple occasions where alcohol restrictions have been discussed by politicians as being introduced to sort of reduce the scourge of domestic and family violence, even when there isn't existing evidence that this type of restriction will impact this outcome. Not all alcohol policies will reduce all types of alcohol harms. And when we conflate something like domestic and family violence with just like alcohol consumption, we make these policies really vulnerable. And what I mean by that is that we open them up to really easy criticism from the alcohol industry when they don't deliver on an outcome that we didn't have evidence that they would impact in the first place. And finally, alcohol policies are not going to be the solution to domestic and family violence. It's an incredibly complex issue. So there's many causal factors, and so multiple prongs approaches are essential. And in some cases, it might be appropriate for alcohol policies to be one of those approaches. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sarah. What a fantastic presentation, incredible body of work, and so fantastic to have done so much research with real world implications during your PhD. I'd like to now invite Michael to turn on his camera and microphone and just encourage the audience to put any questions you might have in the Q&A box so that we can ask Sarah and Michael them soon. But I'll start with you, Michael, and ask you to reflect on Sarah's presentation.
Thanks, Liv. I know my role is to reflect, not to be a hype man, but I was one of Sarah's supervisors, and I want to stress what an incredible effort this PhD was in quite challenging circumstances. They're complicated policies. It's a big project. There's stakeholders, there's data availability trouble, there's whole new analytical methods to learn, and Sarah's just smashed out a series of really excellent pieces of work that I think will have important impacts on policy and practice, and it's been a real joy to be part of it. In terms of the work itself and thinking about what it all means, I think it's been a learning experience for all of us, especially those of us outside the NT, just how complicated evaluating policies in that kind of a setting is. You're talking about quite small populations, every jurisdiction having a different regime of restrictions introduced at various points in time, making it like almost impossible to evaluate things at the NT level because you muddy the waters with whatever happens in Alice Springs or Darwin. You have these small populations, so there can be odd spikes in the data for reasons that you can never really pin down because it only takes one weird weekend and your whole data series looks bizarre. We've spent many meetings talking about what happened in December 2018 and what might have caused this spike, and we've never really figured out what went on. And so I think it's appropriate and important in the way Sarah's talked about the results that for all the kind of attempts for us to be scientific here and to do proper statistical analyses and really try and pin down effects, it's a really difficult and challenging thing to do. And I think the good things of this project are the way that this kind of work will marry up with the qualitative work that's gone on. There'll be a whole kind of series of interlocking parts that kind of give us a better sense of what it all means and what should happen next, although the political situation means that may not matter what we end up coming to put out. But I guess it's been striking to me how always these natural experiments are complicated, but I don't think I've ever experienced a study as laden with challenges as this one has been. That's a reflection, not a question. I think the other thing I think, which Sarah's already covered a little bit in her discussion, is how striking it is when you think about how much domestic violence is used as a motivator for alcohol policy implementation, how rarely it's systematically evaluated. And I remember the systematic review by Ingrid Wilson that Sarah cites had a kind of surprise tone to it about there's all these things that have happened and we don't really know we know what happened to assaults and to hospital admissions. We don't know anything about DV in these various places. And I think that's a really important implication, if nothing else, to kind of keep pushing. And I think it's becoming evident, I think, and it kind of crystallized as you were talking, that availability restrictions may be really crucial. The findings from Tenet are very striking. The evaluation that Boxar ran recently of the bottle shop trading hours being relaxed by just an hour in New South Wales found an effect on domestic and family violence. Michaela's work from NDARC on on-premise restrictions, nightclub hours in Newcastle showed that had reduced restrictions on hours of nightclubs in Newcastle had reduced domestic violence in Newcastle. So there's real potential, I think. And I think there's been a lot of interventions that haven't been well evaluated because we haven't thought about that as an outcome or haven't really fleshed that out. So I think thinking through availability as a key measure and how we implement availability restrictions in different settings has really kind of come through as you spoke as important to me. And given that context, I was hoping I could prompt you to speak a bit more about what's happened out in Alice Springs, sort of outside the scope of your PhD, and what we know about the impacts there at this early point.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so funny. It wasn't until I was putting together this presentation that I realized how similar the Alice Springs restrictions are to the ones that happened in Tennant Creek. It was just like spelling them out. I was like, oh, this actually looks super similar. So yeah, for people who don't know, in July 2022, the Stronger Futures legislation sunset, which meant that places that alcohol had previously been banned by the intervention, so alcohol was banned on all legally Aboriginal land across the NT after the intervention, that was then lifted. It didn't affect lots of places. Lots of places had their own restrictions, like I sort of talked about in the early slides. There's a lot of localized restrictions for specific communities, but for places who didn't have that, alcohol became more accessible, and there was kind of a spike in crime and violence in Alice Springs in the summer of 2022-2023. That got a lot of public attention from both national and not international, territory and national media. And yeah, so there was kind of, oh, we have to do all these changes. And one of the changes was we're going to close bottle shops 2 days a week. We're going to have 1 purchase per person per day. And then they also reintroduced the dry bans about 3 weeks later. We don't have, I understand that there's lots of work going on to like get money to look into this stuff. I think there's some stuff already happening. So we don't actually have peer-reviewed stuff, but just based on like the police stats and the hospital stats that get kind of just put out, we did see a bunch of decreases following those restrictions. So yeah, it'll be really, really interesting to see kind of any like further research that comes out that is looking at that time point. Because yeah, like you said, Michael, I just think it's helpful and interesting when we can see policies that are not costly. Like it doesn't cost the government anything to say that bottle shops have to be shut 1 day a week. In terms of public palatability, that's sort of a different conversation, but at least you're not trying to fight to be like, well, we need all of this money and all of this intervention. Like it's actually resource-wise a fairly simple intervention. So yeah.
It's nice, I think, that there's such enthusiasm to make these changes in policies, but it's almost makes it more difficult to then do your kind of evaluation work because sort of all these policies are introduced at once, which I imagine made your life very challenging during your PhD. Lots of great questions coming in through the Q&A chat box. So we'll start with one from Matt Stevens, who says, thank you, Sarah, for such an in-depth presentation. Are there any examples of community-driven approaches to reduce harm from alcohol? So similar to what happened in Groote Eylandt with youth crime when community elders worked together with families and offenders?
Yeah, absolutely. There's loads of examples. So the NT Liquor Act, which came in like 79, it allowed any community, so it doesn't have to be Aboriginal communities, but it was predominantly taken up by Aboriginal communities. People were able to apply to the Liquor Commission and say, well, this is what we want alcohol access to look like in our area, and lots of places did it. So I think it's about over 100 communities prior to the intervention were dry of their own volition. You mentioned Groote Eylandt. Groote Eylandt also has a permit system like the Gove Peninsula, which is where I live, and like some of this stuff has been evaluated, and they've kind of done really comprehensive evaluations. In terms of like what changes it's had on harms, the building strong evidence bases from community level restrictions is really, really hard to do. For example, so the Groot Island one, they're one of the very few evaluations that actually looked at changes in sexual violence after the restrictions. And they were like, we tried, and there was like 5-ish a year. And so we can't do anything with that. Like there's no sort of stat you can run. There's no way to adjust for seasonality and a tiny, tiny change can make a huge difference. So there are lots of great examples. They often don't end up in peer-reviewed literature, and we often don't have a great sense of what difference they made, just because if we're thinking about like kind of what we consider really high level evidence, you're just never going to be able to generate that sort of evidence on a community level, which is not to say that they shouldn't be done or shouldn't be supported, but I think it can be sometimes harder to sell it to governments or perhaps even to other communities around like, well, here's some options if you don't have kind of that really robust evidence base behind it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think when sort of you've got these community-led interventions that are done so sort of pragmatically and with so community-minded that they're not thinking about how will we evaluate this? How is this going to look? You know, that's not the priority, which is obviously very fair. Grace has asked if there's any further qualitative narratives being explored. The explanation around the increase in confidence and capacity for affected individuals to report domestic family violence added a lot of richness.
Yeah, so that is from Fitzroy Valley, so that's not from the NT, so Northern WA. There isn't any qualitative work. I didn't do any qualitative work around lived experience within my PhD. There is a big chunk of qualitative work that's coming out of the overall project. So they spoke to people on the BDR and their family members. There isn't a focus on domestic and family violence specifically. There's general chat about alcohol-related harms, and I believe domestic and family violence does sort of come up, but it wasn't, it hasn't been a focus.
Michaela has asked you, would it be fair to say that most of these policies affected packaged alcohol rather than on-premise alcohol? And I'm also curious to know what you make of your findings. Why do you think PALIs were effective when the BDR, for example, was not? A big question.
Well, the first part of the question is really easy. Yes, it's mostly packaged alcohol. The discussion in the NT is very focused on takeaway alcohol. There historically has just not been a focus on licensed premises. The last time I can think that there was an intervention that affected licensed premises is like the 90s in Tennant Creek. They did some stuff about like having meals provided at bars, like pretty low level stuff. There it hasn't been like, you guys have opening hours restrictions, you need to be closed certain days. In terms of like as a big policy overall, there also there's been like a little bit of discourse around, well, you have a BDR, and so shouldn't you implement a BDR at a licensed part, like at the pub? You know, like if someone can't go into a bottle shop, surely they shouldn't be allowed to go into the pub. And that kind of hasn't gotten anywhere. So yeah, it absolutely, the focus has primarily been on packaged alcohol. The second part of the question, in terms of the PALIs, I guess because, so the reason we kind of think that they probably had an impact is because we see the decreases across the sites, whereas and it aligns with what the like other evidence would say about around reduced alcohol access. It's also aligned with other reductions in harms. So like other types of assaults went down, like there's other types of alcohol related harms that went down at the same time. Whereas for the BDR, the reason those increases, we didn't say, oh, well, the BDR caused those increases, is that there wasn't, the evidence wasn't there in the hospital data. It was only in the police data. We didn't see, and this is for the broader projects, there wasn't kind of like evidence to say why it would have gone up. It could have gone up. I mean, it could have gone up. And in my thesis, I do say, well, look, if you're reducing someone's access to alcohol and they're withdrawing, or they're trying to get a partner or a family member to buy it for them, do you then like present catalysts for other occurrences of violence, which, is a possibility. I didn't explore it on the side. Sorry, I explored like 15 reasons why it could have gone up or could have not gone up in the thesis. And then I kind of just picked like kind of the ones with the best evidence basically for this slide. But yes, it's completely possible that the BDR did make it go up, but it's, you know, that was like one option of many, I suppose. Like there's always that probable caveat. We're never going to be able to be like, this 100% worked and this 100% didn't.
Thanks, Sarah. Michaela asking a question has made me interested in hearing from Michael, who's worked with both Sarah and Michaela on this kind of research. Michael, I'm wondering if you can sort of give the audience, if you can sort of compare evaluation of policies in New South Wales and the Northern Territory and what the different challenges were in those studies.
Yeah, definitely. And so for people who aren't up with Michaela's work, she built on the evidence around trading hours restrictions in Newcastle, which basically forced the pubs to shut at 3:30 in the morning instead of 5:30 in the morning. And they've been evaluated to within an inch of their lives in terms of their effects on public assaults. And Michaela, as part of her also very impressive PhD, dug into what the impacts were on domestic and family violence. And I think it's a nice segue from Sarah's last answer about how we in this evaluation in the NT, we're always going to be caveating everything super heavily. And Michaela's paper, we still aren't like very 100% confident of a causal relationship, but we're, I would say, more confident because in New South Wales, you have control sites that are broadly similar. You have enough data and enough events happening that you don't get such noisy, spiky data. You have more or less one intervention coming in at one point in time. So you have a more kind of robust sense that if the trend shifts at this point, it's probably for this reason. It's not because of something. It's more, you can be more confident. I think there's the benefit of working in jurisdictions, and in my long distant PhD, I focused on geographic availability, and I just ignored everywhere except Melbourne because populations were too low and data was too noisy. You know, like, this makes my life easy. And so I think there's a real challenge, I think, in doing work in smaller jurisdictions, and especially when they're so policy active as the NT has been. And I think it's a really nice contrast. But even then, in the context of Michaela's work, we just had a meeting a week or two ago where we were discussing how much do we believe this has a causal relationship, and it's the kind of thing that you need to replicate and have interventions, tried out in new places. In Sweden, which is always the dream anecdote, they implemented a randomized control trial of trading hours. The government said, sure, we'll randomize which region gets this intervention. Like, imagine that. Obviously that's implausible, but I think it's really just reflective of the challenge that Sarah faced in trying to draw out kind of causal inference from such a messy situation, and the caution with which we should treat the results of the study in general.
Thanks, Michael. Sarah, Kate Conograve has asked you, or has mentioned, that when they evaluated the Groote Eylandt alcohol permit system, she recalls people saying that while the absolute number of domestic violence incidents reported hasn't reduced much, the severity has reduced, and asked whether hospital or medical evacuation data might be a useful proxy indicator for severity of incidents.
Oh, I like the medical evacuation one. So we included hospital admissions. We did have long discussions about emergency department data with clinicians and with the coders and with all of kind of the people. They clean, and I think it is the same across Australia, but certainly in the NT, they clean the admission data with coders who are like specifically coding for stuff. The ED data doesn't have the same thing. So it's not as reliable. So we did look at hospital admissions. We didn't try and use them as a measure of severity. Like, we didn't dig into what, was it did someone need surgery? How long did someone stay? Which I don't know if it's as easy to, I'm sort of trying to think it through. I think it's very interesting. The data that we had, we couldn't look at severity. And I mean, a reduction in severity would be consistent with what we know from other places, right? Like, alcohol increases severity. My answer is basically, yeah, I think that's
something to think about.
Something to think about for the next one.
Yes, for your postdoc
Yes.
research. Has there been any differences in outcomes between regions and towns within the NT? I think you spoke about different towns, but was that because there were different policies?
Yeah, so because the policies all are slightly different and come in at slightly different times, it makes it really hard to be like the same policy was implemented in two different towns and we're looking at changes. And I suppose Michael kind of alluded to that earlier, like having control sites for NT towns is really hard, sort of the level of like isolation, the size of the populations. There's been lots of discussions in the larger project about what town, like maybe Northern Queensland, WA, what could be used. But it's just a really challenging space. So yeah, yes, there are differences in different towns. However, it's mostly due to like variations in policy, timing, or presence.
Michael, I might ask you this question. Denzel has asked, have there been any similar studies about alcohol restrictions and family or domestic violence in WA, specifically the Kimberley or Pilbara regions?
There have been some really great evaluations of local restrictions in places like, I was going to say Halls Gap, but it's in Victoria, Halls Creek, I think, where, again, mostly availability restrictions have been effective at reducing harms. I can't recall, and again, these are mostly not published in the peer-reviewed literature. They're reports, they're reasonably robust, but not probably as sophisticated as Sarah's work methodologically. And I can't recall if they look at domestic violence per se. Often those kinds of evaluations haven't, but I suspect they did. And I think they showed some benefits, but I'm going to have to vague out on the specifics because it's been a while since I looked at them. I know there's a whole bunch of like political activity around a banned drinkers registry in parts of the Pilbara and WA. It's a different beast than the NT one in terms of it being voluntary for industry to sign up to. I don't expect it will be more effective than the NT one, I guess, is what I would say if there was an evaluation of it, because it's the NT one doesn't look like it was that effective, and it's more solidly implemented, I guess, than the WA one. But yeah, I think there is bits of work that goes on in local areas, often government funded, looking at community restrictions, which is really valuable and gets kind of lost to the research field a little bit. I think it would be really great if there was more funding and energy for evaluations of that kind of work to get published in peer-reviewed journals and to get included in systematic reviews. And I think there's so much rich knowledge at the community level that we're not always getting at the level where it matters for policy and implementation.
Thanks, Michael. So many more good audience questions here. So we'll just have to get to a few more before we wrap up. Sarah, Sasha has asked, she said she knows it's outside the remit of your PhD, but wondering if in the course of your research you've come across anything that indicated any relationship between the alcohol policy and mandatory reporting.
So I think we mean the mandatory reporting that I mentioned in the earlier slides, the mandatory reporting for all domestic violence victims. So yes, we were like, oh, okay, well, there's mandatory reporting, like we should be able to get that data. The thing about the way mandatory reporting is set up for adult domestic and family violence victims is that it's just a call to police. So they're unlike child mandatory reporting where like, anyone who knows anyone who's worked in a school or in a hospital, like there's a hotline and you call them and you give certain information and like it's recorded extremely systematically. That is not the way that this works. This is you just call into the police. And so from that perspective, there's no like real capture of that. It also had that in legislation was also introduced in 2009. So that's like quite a long time prior to this policy, and it's just kind of been in place since then, but we don't really have, I would say, like we don't really have data in terms of does that make a difference to reporting.
I think this also links to a question from an anonymous attendee about whether the tool used to assess domestic violence is feasible and acceptable to the local context. So is it you're getting your data from police reports only?
So police reports and hospital data, so it's all admin data.
Right, yeah.
Like I should say admin data, like a lot of data sources, it's collected for a service provision perspective, right? Like it's collected by the doctors to be used for the care of a person, and then they give it to other people. So it's not set up to like be the most robust way of collecting domestic and family violence. The stuff that the incidents that we have ended up looking at are going to be those really, really high end things. It's not going to be a representative of actually how much domestic, family and sexual violence goes on in the community.
There's a question here about sort of socio-cultural context in the NT about alcohol consumption, and if it's a favourable one, whether implementing these laws is quite challenging in that setting, and whether you can sort of provide some non-Northern Territory residents some context on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say the NT's favourability towards alcohol is pretty high. There is a lot of history of particularly Aboriginal communities asking for those dry restrictions. So there's definitely pockets of the NT population who are very anti-alcohol, but it's pretty socially acceptable to do things up here that you don't necessarily do down south. Like drink driving is really high up here. It's very socially acceptable in a way that it really isn't in other states. Michael, you're going to say something?
I remember being up there at one point when they were talking about maybe implementing 0.05 restrictions for driving a boat, and the outcry, the outrage was palpable.
Can I tell you my favourite fact about that is that was a recommendation from the Riley Review, so part of this working package, and the government accepted it in principle and were like, yep, that sounds extremely reasonable. And what the opposite of commercial, like the hobby fishermen, that lobby in the NT is wildly powerful, and you still do not need a license, nor is there any BAC limit to drive a boat up here. So yeah, it's very socially acceptable to drink, and that is actually why those closing opening hours, that is why that is really hard to get in, and that's why we don't have something like that in somewhere like Darwin. So we had it in Tennant Creek, and that was because of something that was a really critical issue, and that's kind of how the Alice Springs one came in as well. It was like seen as a really critical issue. They're not publicly well supported.
We're just about to run out of time, but I want to squeeze in one more question from Cass, who's interested in both Sarah and Michael, your thoughts on this. If domestic, family and sexual violence can create an alcohol policy window that opens an opportunity to focus on alcohol that wouldn't otherwise be there, is that problematic or is that strategic? I think I'm going to give you about 30 seconds each to give us your thoughts on that.
Go first, Michael.
Oh God, I don't have a good answer. I've been thinking about this in the context of discussions about MUPs in other settings in Australia, and often motivated by a genuine desire to reduce domestic violence. And I think an MUP in WA or nationally would be great and likely reduce alcohol harms. Would it be a problem if it didn't reduce the harm that was the main kind of lever to get it implemented? Like, would that make the policy seem a failure? So in Scotland, I'm going to spend more than 30 seconds, sorry, Liv. In Scotland, it didn't really affect violence, but it saved a whole bunch of lives, the minimum unit price. And maybe that would happen here. And if we relied too heavily on the domestic violence window, would that mean it could be framed as a failed policy? I don't know. So I'm not sure on the politics or the appropriateness. Sorry.
Good response.
My very quick one is that I think it depends if you're trying to get it, like, is it a researcher or an advocate trying to sell it to the government? So talking about, things that they care about. Maybe they do care about alcohol-involved domestic violence. I think where it becomes trickier is when then that politician tries to sell it as reducing alcohol involved domestic violence. Like, I think it just makes policies quite vulnerable because it makes it easy for the industry to be like, well, domestic family violence rates didn't go down, this policy failed. It's a good question though. It's
very good question. Almost as if it came from your PhD supervisor. All right, so we'll have to wrap up there. Thanks again, Sarah and Michael. It's been such an interesting and informative discussion, and thanks to the audience for being so engaged. We got so many questions for Sarah and Michael, which was great. Before we bring the webinar to a close, just a reminder that we won't have a webinar next week as we're busy preparing for the annual symposium. But on the 26th of September, we'll be back with Dr. Michael Curtis from the Burnett Institute who will be talking about retention in opioid agonist treatment and how that influences substance use, health, and service utilization in men post-prison. But that is all from us. So thanks everyone for joining us and hope you have a great afternoon.